Hello, everybody. This is John Eichberger, the Executive Director of the Fuels Institute. Welcome to today's webinar to talk about the implications of the current shutdown associated with the pandemic on travel patterns in the United States. Welcome, you guys. I'm glad you're here with us. For those of you who are not familiar with the Fuels Institute, if this is your first time engaging with us, give you a quick kind of overview of what we're trying to achieve with webinars like this. The Fuels Institute is a non-advocacy, non-profit research group. Our objective is to provide stakeholders in the transportation market with data, analysis, and information to help them make better decisions and better understand what's going on in the market around them. Today, we're going to be talking with Bob Pishue with INRIX. He's a transportation analyst over there. If you're not familiar with INRIX, you're going to become very familiar with them. They have really, since the shutdown started, 5-6 weeks ago, they have really stepped up and provided a lot of insight into what's happening with travel patterns, what's happening with total vehicle miles traveled, where we're seeing travel disruptions, and what has happened in terms of people not going on the roads. We know people are at stay-at-home orders, but what does that mean for the transportation sector? We have been relying on their analysis for the last several weeks to help us kind of stay on top of what's going on, and I'm really excited to have them on board for today's webinar. Process-wise, we're going to have a lot of people on the call. So if you have a question, use the chat feature, and we will go through the chats at the end of the presentation and try to answer as many of the questions that come through as possible. But it's really a great opportunity for us to have an understanding of what's going on in the market. So with that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking. I'm going to turn over to Bob. And please help me welcome Bob Pishue with INRIX to tell us what people are doing in terms of travel today. Bob, it's all yours.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thank you, Fuels Institute, for hosting this webinar. As we know, the COVID scenario and everything going on with it, the pandemic, has really affected our way of life. So I hope that everyone out there is staying safe. I'll get into my background a little bit here in a couple of slides, but I kind of wanted to preface this presentation with this is a snapshot, sort of a state of the union in transportation, I would say. But the important thing here, I think, is to see how we can move forward. How do we begin to rebuild? You know, the only way we can look toward the future is to look at where we're at now. And so I'd like all of your listeners out there, my email's down here. Feel free to just shoot me an email or provide your thoughts in the form of questions about kind of, start to think about how this data can be useful. So because there are a million things on my list to look at, and to try to figure out how we can best move forward, what should be targeted, what industries are lagging, which are doing really well, etc. So with that, I'll give a brief background statement into INRIX. So INRIX has been around for a while, 15 years and counting. So one of the first, if not the first, in this space of transportation analytics, traffic movement, etc., based off of big data. So who do we partner with? We partner with all levels of government to provide data and analytics. With that, they can prioritize investments, move traffic more efficiently through things like signal timing and mapping out their road system, and improving the quality of life for citizens, basically. As we know, in great times when the economy is booming, traffic is more of a pain point. So it's one of those side effects from growth, and managing and alleviating some of that pain is a big priority for public officials. And so they use our data in a multitude of ways to do that. Partner with businesses. As you could imagine, when someone is locating, let's just say a restaurant, a quick service restaurant, getting a lay of the land as far as transportation and visits to see how people move back and forth or choose restaurants over others can really allow you to make a smarter decision and locate your business in a high traffic, high volume area where you could grab, some market share. It could be for a business for parking management. So a big mall or something like that could want to manage parking more efficiently. And the list goes on and on. And automakers. So you're driving in a car. Again, traffic is a frustration for you. And so something to say, hey, look, there's an open parking spot 3 blocks away. So then you don't have to circle around downtown looking for traffic. Telling you of an accident, 3 miles down the road allows you to, have a safer driving environment out there. So INRIX Research is a research arm of INRIX. It was founded a couple of years ago. I was also by yours truly and part of the team a few years ago. I had left for a couple of years, but now I'm back. And it's a team of data scientists, transportation analysts, the data guys behind how do we take all of this data out there and make it meaningful. And that's what our team is comprised of. You may have seen some of our studies. So our global traffic scorecard is kind of our big piece that analyzes, travel behavior in nearly 1,000 cities across multiple countries. It kind of talks about it quantifies the pain that a lot of drivers qualitatively feel, that frustration, but also it highlights what cities and governments are doing to alleviate and manage some of that congestion. We've also done studies as far as QSR insights. So as I mentioned earlier, quick service restaurants. And we also do analysis on the future. So with AVs coming, where would it be, if AVs are going to be deployed, where are the best spots to do it? What are the goals in mind? And so we look at different cities and different environments to kind of put the data into it. As far as yours truly, I have more of a policy background. So I've dealt with state and local governments, some federal, about transportation funding, finance, land use issues, you name it. And so as you can imagine, data is a huge part of that. So without much further ado, I'll kind of touch into kind of one of our last studies that looked at COVID that we published, and then I'll give all of you some insight into what we're doing now and what we look to be doing in the future. So I believe this was brought up on the last webinar a month ago. It was our impact of COVID-19 to commuting and retail. And in that, we looked at Seattle. So we're based out of Seattle. And Seattle was the initial hotbed of COVID. A really sad story. It was just a few miles from our office, but that allowed us to see how companies respond, how the government responds, and what that means to the economy. So it's kind of a first look at what's going on related to all of these things. And then also we expect it to be one of those that are sort of first out of the gate. And so I think it's a good test case to look at to see what happened. And you can read more of that study. It's on our website for the commuting and retail. But basically what it looked at is it looked at all sorts of different trips that people make. It looked at the distance of trips, how does it look like going to grocery stores specifically and big box retailers specifically, as well as malls, to get an idea of how consumer behavior, how driver behavior changed, almost right away with Amazon and Microsoft both being based here. When they instituted their policy, what did travel look like just to downtown or South Lake Union for Amazon? So it can get very dialed in. And that's sort of the beauty of big data. You can, instead of just looking at big box retailers, we could have actually go further and look at home improvement big box retailers or electronics or, something like that to get an idea of different industries. So I advise, any of you, if you're interested in it, please read that, but there are more studies coming. So now we're going to get into kind of what is some of the latest data on what we're seeing. We are likely publishing a blog today or tomorrow with some further insights, and so please keep your eyes peeled on that. So the first one, as a transportation analyst, is how much people, how are people traveling compared to normal? What we've seen, so as we're looking at this week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, that started, week 1 is about the March 14th to March 20th, I believe. And from then on, each week, corresponds to the next Sunday through Saturday. And what we saw is by week 1, personal VMT was down 20%. That's a lot. That's unprecedented. I've never seen anything like that on a national basis. Sometimes you could see that on a regional basis if there are, unfortunate events like natural disasters and other type things. But as you can see, by week 2, that grew to about 42%. And as obviously the curve, the downward trend has continued, but at a much slower rate running into week 4. Keep in mind during this time that certain states have been shutting down or closing, non-essential businesses. And so looking at this through that lens really helps to see, kind of analyze, okay, 21 states in week 2, I believe, gave orders. Some did not, and some delayed their orders until later. And so what we see is here are just the top 10 changes by state. And you can see, Hawaii, New Jersey, Michigan, Florida. It's not much variation between the two. I guess in terms of VMT, it's a lot. 7% is a lot. But as you can see, though, 60s and 50s is kind of what we're seeing across the country, with a few down by about 40% towards the bottom of this list. And then we can drill down into metro area for personal travel. I will say that I think, as we look at this, there is so much that depends on personal travel, even if you're in the freight space, even if you're in the safety space for your businesses or your organizations. It's all interrelated. And, if you're interested in safety or you're interested in fuel, how does personal travel, which funds a lot of the highway network, through gas taxes, tolls, other fees, et cetera, how does that affect what lawmakers or policymakers might do to try to fill budget gaps? I don't want to speculate on here, but I'm just trying to show the interconnectedness of all of this. And obviously the economy is tied to personal travel as well. So as we can see, obviously New York City has been hit pretty hard by the coronavirus, as well as seeing the largest reduction out of 94 metro areas that we looked at. And as you can see, some of these move, but they're starting to somewhat slow the move. So like I mentioned before, that it's sort of planing out, at least as far as the declines are going. And as you can read in our blog post that we'll post shortly, it's starting to level out. I know I titled this in the United States, but I decided to take a look at just some kind of high level international trends as well. And we can see on the left, Italy, for example, which was hard hit by the coronavirus, started reducing travel much earlier than the United Kingdom, for example. And we can kind of see the vehicle miles traveled, or the amount people drive in passenger or personal vehicles, decline much sooner than in the UK. So I want to talk about freight travel too. It's more specifically in this slide, long haul trucking. It's been falling, but it has been much less volatile it's decreased at a slower rate. And so as you can see by the chart on the left, it actually increased a shade in week 1, a decent drop in week 2, sort of leveled out in week 3, but then dropped again in week 4. And early data suggests in week 5 it dropped a little bit more. And so this is for the entire United States. So what I want to do is get a little bit more regional look to see if there were any trends by region. And so that's what you see on the right-hand side. And a couple interesting things about this is that the Southern Gulf, so I split these up into areas that the Federal Highway Administration uses. So the Southern Gulf has decreased, has gone down more than the national number has, which is interesting, as well as North Central. The North Central is interesting because Michigan is in there, and Michigan has dropped quite a bit. Ohio has dropped quite a bit. Indiana has dropped quite a bit, and all of those tend to be, or manufacturing is a large portion of their gross domestic product, around 20% or so. And so, it kind of gives an idea. It's not perfect, but it's probably likely one factor. There are other factors. Weather. It's been unusually cold in the Michigan area, still getting some winter weather. Other things may play a part in this, but as you can see also, like the Western U.S. Has only gone down a couple of percentage points and has sort of leveled out around 2%, which is, again, very interesting. I think the overall picture, though, is that largely, at least, when compared to personal travel, the freight network is still shouldering the load. Thank a trucker is one thing that I've done, at least on social media, because all of those goods and services still need to be moved around, and it appears to not be as effective. So also looking at local fleets, your deliveries, your package deliveries, those types of things, nationwide. It too is down, but not as down as much as personal travel. It's holding around 80% of normal, maybe a tick higher. And so the orange is local fleets, and the blue is long haul fleets. And there are probably a million different things that you could analyze from this. But I think that the number one takeaway for me, at least, is that deliveries are still happening. We're seeing, definitely some things in the manufacturing sector, like I mentioned before, with auto plants closing and restaurants, shutting down or only doing deliveries. A lot of shopping malls and large kind of retail spaces are not doing as much business, but people are still getting package deliveries and other deliveries. And so I think that that's some good insight that, if we use just, personal travel as a proxy for the economy, and that's down, 40, 50%, let's say, that would, that could definitely throw up some red flags as far as the economy goes, or at least yellow flags. But with, trucking doing well and local fleets doing well, or at least relatively well, we can see that economic activity is still happening, which I think is at least a takeaway that I have from that, and I'm sure a lot of you out there also have your own take. So, of course, what has that done to travel speeds? No surprise, travel speeds are up. So I took a look at 5 metro areas and looked at speeds on FRC 1s and 2s. So that is basically national interstates, limited access highways, and expressway type roads. And what we saw is no surprise. Average speeds are up, with the most dramatic in LA and New York City, or New York City metro area, I should say, at 5 p.m. And so also another one to keep your eyes on are traffic incidents. So I took a look at kind of unplanned road closures. So there are road closures for things like construction or repair work, you name it. There are a lot of planned road closures for a number of reasons. But then there are unplanned as well, which obviously can be due to accidents or a dog running across the road, or I've seen one where there was a swimming pool on the road. So that's definitely unplanned unless someone was planning to take a swim on the highway. So same city, Chicago, Detroit, LA, New York, and DC. And we definitely see some variation across each metro area. You can't necessarily equate this with, at least the chart that I've given you, with severity, but we can see, though, that there is a drop. One interesting thing here, though, is that it doesn't appear, these don't appear to have dropped as much as personal travel. So, the initial data suggests, though, that there are fewer incidents, but as a rate of per mile traveled, it appears that incidents are up per mile traveled, which is interesting if you are in the insurance sector or some other type of safety company or something like that to analyze how things are going per mile driven. And so I'll just close with this. I tend to like Q&A more than just reading off of a PowerPoint. So I'm interested in hearing what the viewers of this and the Fuels Institute has as far as questions regarding data. What are we able to do? What are we not able to do? I mean, all of those types of things. So I'm looking at sector-specific rebound. So with INRIX data, we can look at what's happening in certain sectors. So as you can imagine, office and hotels, that's a big question. As I think it's sort of inevitable that more people will telecommute, at least in the long run. Some people are itching, I know, just to get back in the office. But what does that mean for industries like hotels that depend on, travel, long distance air travel, et cetera? Like I mentioned, road closures is always one to continue to follow. Restaurants, how do those pick up? And in what markets, I think, is the key. Are they going to, depending on how certain state and local governments open things up, it'll be interesting to see how what the data shows as far as what are successful ways to open up, what aren't maybe so successful, those types of things. You could also think of it too, if you're a restaurant and let's say you have drive-through. Like I can think of a big coffee retailer here in Seattle that has opened up, quite a few drive-through coffee, a drive-through coffee business. And some are open, some are not. Maybe beforehand the catchment area was X. People are willing to drive 5-10 minutes to come get a coffee, but now maybe they're, taking 20 minutes or willing to drive 20 minutes. So what does that look for as a catchment area for businesses as we rebound? Larger economic trends. I'll have to admit this is the one that kind of that I'm really interested in. And that's, how are the ports still operating? Are there still a lot of trucks coming in and out of the port? Manufacturing, as I mentioned before, retail and leisure. Look at how are malls doing? What are visits to parks and theme parks? Things like movie theaters. Are people, going back? How are they transitioning back into being in groups of other people? Sporting events are another one, and that also gives you some insight into the economy if people are willing, to go back to that. As I mentioned before, working from home, so mode shifts. What does it look like in terms of people walking and biking? What does it look like in terms of people taking transit? A lot of transit agencies are going back and looking at their model and trying to figure out how the future of transit looks, as well as working from home. And again, how does that go to the funding and financing of these road projects? So a lot of these projects rely on gas tax revenue. There's been a lot of talks in a bunch of different states, as well as the federal government on a per mile fee in lieu of a gas tax. How does that look now? What does it do to local budgets, which affect so many it obviously affects all of our businesses, our living situations, what taxes look like, where they get allocated, and so that's important for businesses of all types to take a look at. And what are the federal plans? So the feds haven't raised the gas tax in over 25 years, and so what does that look like as far as going forward, and what kind of burdens does that place on businesses? What projects would it go to? So all of those things we're continuing to look at. I'm always open to new ideas because there's just so much to get to here. And again, to preface, this is really about rebounding. This is, whether or not, you're happy with or not happy, I guess no one's happy. Whether or not you think it's, a good idea to shut down construction in your local city or a bad idea, or whether, however your opinion goes about that. What's important also is how we reopen and getting reopened and getting people out and about to practice these economic activities that we all depend on. School club, what does it look like for schools reopening? Kind of those things that affect us all around the dinner table. And so that's what I try to focus on here. And with that, I'll open it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Appreciate the quick overview. We were getting a couple questions as we were going through, just kind of set the context. Your analysis of week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, that's comparing to a baseline week of February 22nd, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and then week 1 started when? Was that March 16th, that time frame?
I believe it was March 14th. I can pull that up though while you ask.
Right, so right about that week then. And then while you were talking, I multitasked and pulled up the blog. It is up now, and it looks like week 4 VMT was down 48%. Week 5, which is last week, ticked up a little bit, down 46%. So slight increase in travel out there. And when I first started looking at your data, I wanted to know, okay, does that sound about right? So I checked in with some people who analyze fuel sales, and those are on a last year to this year basis. But fuel sales are down 45, 50% too. So they seem to be going hand in hand.
Yeah.
With that said, can you share your methodology? How does INRIX measure travel? How do you track where people are going and what type of miles they're putting on the car? Where does this data come from?
Yeah, that's a good question, and probably something I should have touched on when I introduced who INRIX is. So we collect our data through anonymous. All of our data is anonymized before we even get it. We get it from multiple sources. So it's GPS probe data for the most part. Some data pieces are from physical infrastructure. So from loop detectors, we partner with a lot of DOTs and things like that. So some of the data comes from hard things like loop detectors or parking gates going up and down. All of that is data that we take into account. Some automakers use, INRIX traffic, INRIX parking. Those are our services. And so data comes from some autos as well. And also fleets. So one of the reasons why we have really great coverage everywhere is because of our fleet data as well. So we have a good source of all of these different types of information in order to snap all the data that's out there and snap it to a road segment. And so that's where and how we collect our data.
Okay. And then you did some breakdowns of metropolitan areas. Have you done analysis comparing the impact on travel for rural versus urban areas?
No, I have not yet. That is one area that I would love to look at because obviously there are different habits in rural versus metro. But another thing I wanted to look at is interstate travel. So how many people are going from, pick a state, California to Nevada, is that sort of connection in between states, with different policies in one state and different policies in another, or you name it. Leisure could be affected in that way. So that's another thing that we intend to look at as well.
Now, I will say to that question that was raised in the last blog, there is a map of the United States that shows the impact on travel by state. And so you could actually say, some more rural states, Montana, South Dakota, those there, you can take a look at how that's affected it. But that also has an impact on the movement of goods. So I was very interested in your slide on freight travel, because you guys broke it down in your presentation by regions. And it looks like the regions that have had the largest decline in freight travel are the Southern Gulf and then the North Central.
Yeah.
And you and I were chatting a little bit last week. Any theory as to why those regions may have been more heavily impacted in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I've got my theories, but I tend to not like to. I have my theories about everything, and that's why they're theories and not.
But they're not conspiracy theories. That's important.
No, I do think, as I mentioned in the, I do think manufacturing has at least a large effect. I know people in the Detroit, Michigan area, and just for some, hey, how are things going there? I know that that's a little anecdotal, but the human element also matters. And yeah, I think manufacturing. I've looked at, and you can actually, just go on Bureau of Economic Analysis and pull up, oil and gas exploration. What is that? As your viewers know. And I also noticed that Kentucky was hit hard. Well, that's mostly manufacturing, or at least, another 20% of their GDP or so. And so that's sort of what, and then you could probably take in, like, what are inventories doing at businesses right now? How do those type of individual decisions on the micro level translate to some of these macro trends that we're seeing, or at least, I hate to call them trends because that makes it seem like they're going to keep going, but at least what we're seeing on the ground today.
And that's kind of important because you're measuring what's happening at this moment, and your final slides are talking about rebound. We're having a lot of discussion about when will the economy start to reopen, how fast will it reopen, and then what will be the consumer behavior that comes along with that. I mean, we've got companies out there, businesses out there that they need to reopen in order to stay in business. Are they going to go upside down? But a lot of that is really going to depend on how quickly consumers get back in their cars and start traveling. From the data you've seen, and I haven't really looked closely at the blog that came out today, are you seeing any type of trends or any type of indications that would lead us to be able to speculate as to what that rebound in travel might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think for that, the metric I would use is personal travel, and we can drill down and see how targeted that is. As I mentioned before, in one of our studies, it was the impact in Seattle on bulk retailers. And like I said, kind of lumping Home Depot and Best Buy together makes sense from a broader view, or Home Depot and a Costco, right? Both huge, both have, but very different offerings. And so I think what, the important thing here is that it can be much targeted to get an idea of what's going on. So personal travel and visits, are people pinging multiple stores, or are they going to one for all their needs and then going home? I think that type of the ability to have variety also the data comes out after the fact or during real time, but those types of activities I think will introduce the idea that people are more willing to go to multiple stops. And that's interesting because it sort of breaks out, okay, I'm going to the store, coming home. That's it. As soon as trips start getting chained together again, I think that's another indicator. There are probably so many I can't even think of all at once, but that to me seems like a pretty decent one to just take a look at and see how that reflects with the economy, unemployment rates, you name it, right? There are a bunch of different indicators to look at here.
So a question from one of the audience members was, are you seeing any outliers in terms of states with regards to their travel behavior and their stay-at-home orders? Does it seem like some states have had you've shown metropolitan areas, but are some states seeming to be a little less impacted by this than others?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go through all my charts to give exact numbers, but my general takeaway, I think you mentioned it, like Montana, Wyoming, some of those states, I think, are not seeing as much impact from this. But surprisingly, I thought they were more impacted than I thought they would be. I figured, Wyoming, where I don't know the population density of Wyoming, but it's pretty low.
Right.
And so I was surprised when, I mean, even some of the lowest, the drop in personal vehicle miles traveled was, a drop of 40% in Wyoming or somewhere around there. Don't quote me on that, but that seemed like a bit much to me. And so those are kind of the outliers, I would say. But also, and it's important too when you're looking at states versus metro, is that New York State and New York City, that's just a good juxtaposition of different things. So lumping it all into one state can be a bit dicey, I guess, from a data perspective.
Yeah. There's another question here that maybe I can kind of take a shot at. The question is about the lost road tax revenue. People aren't driving, so they're not buying fuel. You mentioned the gas tax and the need to fund our construction projects. But then it branches into the convenience store business channel also collects a ton of money in taxes, from sales taxes to tobacco taxes to a variety of mechanisms. The convenience store industry likes to say they're the tax collector for America sometimes, because they do generate a ton of revenue back to the state. And the question is, what is the overall impact on the revenue streams for the governments? And, we don't know yet. We have not really seen what's happening in terms of overall sales inside the store. I do know the convenience industry has always been somewhat recession resistant, and we can kind of take that as a model for this. People are out of work or they're not able to go anywhere. They still drink beer, they still smoke cigarettes, they still usually buy fuel. We got to take a look what's going on inside the store sales wise. But there's the impact on overall economic performance and the government funding is going to be significant. And it's going to take some time to really figure out what that impact's going to be. But with the government support initiatives that are being launched and the investment in the economy and the population, which are vitally necessary, we are losing that revenue stream. And it's going to have a long-term impact. Any thoughts, Bob?
Oh, I totally agree with you. Right. And whether I was reading the other day, just locally here in Washington State, they haven't come up with a new one, but I was looking at the Office of Financial Management fuel tax forecast that was published like the 20th of February. And it's like, we expect it to go, up 1.5%, and there was nothing in the report that indicated, obviously, right? I mean, you can't have them predict if they could, if they could predict that.
This was not in any of the flux case scenarios that were done.
No,
analysis.
No. Yeah. And they do, a sensitivity analysis. That's right. Like, the worst case, the dire look. And I'm going, okay, I'd take the dire look on that. But yes, I think that you're absolutely right. Depending, I'm sure a lot of, if not most, if not all, have some sort of a lottery, right? The convenience stores do a lot of lottery work. Well, does lottery money maybe earmarked for schools or earmarked for some other purpose? And so does that mean that they start hitting up the general fund, which means less money for this? And then it cascades all over the place. So I agree with you on that.
So I think the impacts are going to be significant and long-term, and we're going to be paying for it for a long time. Another question came up that is something I've been struggling with for a long time is, what is the percent of personal miles traveled that is kind of to and from work or non-discretionary? We've had debates within the fuels industry for years that people argue, with lower gas prices, people are going to drive more. And my response has always been, look, there is a finite amount of discretionary travel available to the consumer. most of their travel is mandatory. Do you have an idea of how much travel is work related or required compared to optional?
Yeah. So two things. So what we do at INRIX is we look at, obviously destination and trip and all of that, right? So we can kind of get an idea of, what's the mode, why are people going to Home Depot, right? I mean, you can kind of get an idea. Now, some people are going there for work. So the trip purpose is an interesting one. I would recommend, yes, there are things out there. The National Household Travel Survey put out by the federal government does break that down. And I think the commute during rush hour or, the go to work is somewhere around 20% of people on the road are going to work. A surprising number of people are not there for a work purpose, but it's still a necessary trip, right? So it's people dropping their kids off at daycare, it's people shopping, it's taking people to the airport. There are a million different reasons to take trips. But yeah, I would probably start out with the household travel survey and work from there.
That is a great resource. And, people interested in it. A couple of years ago, the Fuels Institute published a report called Driver Demographics, which relied heavily on the previous version of the household travel survey. So it's a little old, a little outdated, but it still gives an indication of where people have been. And it looks historically over the last 50 years of purpose for trips, number of trips, demographics that attribute to trip frequency and destinations. It's a fantastic report. And so I encourage you to look at the person who asked the question, look at the National Household Travel Survey online, and also go to our website at fuelsinstitute.org and download that report. It's free, but it's a good read and a lot of good insight. Another question we had is, how does VMT correlate to GDP?
Yeah.
And I'll just tee it off with one quick comment. I took a look at national VMT over time and did a chart and saw that the only time we've really seen a sustained decline in vehicle miles traveled was during the Great Recession. And between 2008 and 2011, I think we lost 2.7% of miles traveled. And then we quickly caught back up and kept on an upward trajectory. Have you seen any correlation between miles traveled and overall GDP?
Yeah, the Federal Highway Administration has looked into this very question. If you look at VMT and GDP charts, they sort of go hand in hand up until you said that the Great Recession period, where we did see a dip, I think the first ever dip in VMT for any sustained amount of time. So I would definitely say that they're correlated, and so. But I mean, but I wouldn't say that they're totally lockstep in every way. I guess that's sort of the fear, is that we take, a 40% drop in VMT and say, oh, the economy is going to drop some factor of that, 20%, 30%. I think it's important to look at as part of a larger equation. Obviously, there's employment, other things to that. That's just one variable. But yeah, I mean, generally in the past, for the last 70 years since VMT was being tracked, they do trend very closely together.
And I think this situation we're in now is very different from anything, obviously, that we've experienced in the past. And the lack of travel, I don't think, is the causal factor. I think the lack of being able to participate in the economy will be the causal factor on GDP. And you're right. We lost some travel during the Great Recession because people weren't driving to work and they stopped driving around. They didn't have any money to drive around. We're in a different situation where when we come out of this, we may not have the businesses that we had previously. We may have consumer behavior has changed. You got 5 to 8 weeks of not going out to eat, not doing the things you used to do. And you realize, hey, I can live like that. I can cut back on my expenses and my investment back in the economy. For those businesses that come out of this and survive, that rationale of the consumer mindset changing could be devastating. They say when you reopen the economy and the businesses open up the doors, great, where is everybody? And only the regulars come back, and maybe not even all the regulars come back. That could be pretty scary for a business owner.
Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine building a hotel right now or something like that? Those types of decisions are, yeah, I agree. They're still kind of up in the air as to how this happens. And I do agree with you. And what's different about the Great Recession, and obviously this, is that one is sort of just human behavior exemplified in what's going on with the economy, right? I mean, it's like, okay, well, I'm sort of scared for my job or something like that in the Great Recession. So I choose not to go to this restaurant. That's a bit different than this restaurant or whatever is forced to be closed and I have no choice. So that's, I think, the big difference as we move forward is how does the economy operate in this type of scenario?
And how do we come out of it? And I think you and I had a conversation, and people have laughed at me for this analogy, but the American consumer, or the consumer across the world, could take one of two extremes. Open the economy and they flood out of their houses like cockroaches trying to escape their confines that they've been in. Or they step out like Punxsutawney Phil, see their shadow and run back inside. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in between is going to be reality, but those are the two extreme reactions I see as potential behavior once we open it up, and you're going to be on the other side of it. And related to that, here's a question that came in: is what's the prediction on demand growth, commuters, shoppers, recreation? And it kind of goes hand in hand with what do we think consumers are going to do? They're going to go back to work, so they're going to start commuting again. We've talked about maybe employers that were not fans of telecommuting have not had a choice recently. Now maybe they realize, hey, this isn't so bad. Maybe we can start doing some telecommuting. So we might see some reduction in commuting times, but people start commuting, but then shopping, going out to eat for restaurants and stuff. What are the potential metrics we need to be watching for that?
Yeah, I think it's so to bring it back to traffic data and transportation. Sort of like I mentioned in my presentation, was that, look at the restaurant sector, or look at something like theme parks or zoos or something. I mean, try to find something that, at least in my view, try to find something that is almost completely leisure purpose. And, take a sporting event, for example. Gosh, the sun is like coming right in. I can't avoid it. So I'm going to just lean off to the side. Something leisure-based. So are people willing to go to a football game or a high school football game? Something like that shows people are willing to go and interact with others. And I think once we start seeing those trends, that will give us, you can kind of talk about it from the business side, but then also from the consumer behavior side. And I think people, not only do they maybe want to go to restaurants, right? Or choose to go to restaurants or choose to eat at home, but maybe they want to go to restaurants, but they're still concerned about coronavirus, so they don't. That's a completely different activity than, oh, I'm now cooking from home for the rest of my life, right? And so it's those types of, I think, things that we're trying to figure out is what are people, what's in their mind, and why are they doing the things that they're doing? Because that's the real important metric is to try to figure out why they're making the decisions that they are.
One comment on this that we received was, after World War I, we entered the Roaring '20s, where people just kind of went crazy. And the question is, what is the potential for us going back to that? And again, that's the cockroach versus groundhog theory. Is what is it going to be? And I think if we pay attention to the data that you guys are tracking, kind of give us an indication of how, once we start the rebound, we start seeing people travel, we start analyzing where they're traveling and how much they're traveling, that might give us a little more insight into what their mindset could be. And we combine that with, there's tons of consumer surveys going on right now because people are home, they have nothing better to do but answer surveys. We can marry those up and start getting some indication of what the next phase of our social engagement might look like.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah. I completely agree, and that's why I think it's not only important for governments, but also for private companies and private industry to really pay attention. I mean, it's always important to track what your consumers are doing and what they're thinking, right? Or why are they making the decision to buy this at $10 or this at $15? Is it a perceived value? Is it, there are all sorts of things. But I think that's why this data is so important, is that you'll probably never really know what's in their mind, but at least another data point to help you out as you move into recovery and try to keep, maintain, or grow your business is key. Another data point does not hurt.
And your point that we never really know what's in their mind is critical, because you're going to ask them a question, they're going to tell you what they want you to hear. We've asked people years and years, would you pay more for an environmentally sensitive gasoline product? Oh, absolutely. How much? I pay $1 more for an environmentally renewable fuel for my vehicle. And I always say, they tell you they want to be green, but when they pull up to the pump, the only green they care about is in their wallet. And they're going to vote with their wallet. They're not going to purchase based upon an altruistic mindset. They're going to be driven. But when you ask them, they're going to tell you what they want you to think about them. Because that projecting their own personal profile is very important to the consumer. So whenever you do consumer surveys, you always have to take it with a big grain of salt and then validate it with data like what you guys are collecting.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So another question we had was, as a follow-up to the VMT question, is, I know it's not personal VMT. Usually that's the national vehicle miles traveled that people track. There are reports of a 3% reduction in GDP. Is there any way to track back in VMT from that number, assuming a perfect correlation? So looking historically, would it be possible to look at trends in GDP and find a factor of correlation to VMT that might give us some indication?
Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head if anyone has, I'm sure people have done it. I'm sure that's out there. I just have not read any of those, or I haven't looked into great detail into that specific thing. How closely do they correlate? Can you go back and use data? I think that, yeah, I mean, I'd have to think too that on a similar note, that sort of shows the flexibility of using this data for a purpose. So like I mentioned, the incidence data, and sorry to kind of segue into this, but I think that they're connected. And that's, what does that mean for, accidents on the road? What does that correlate to? Insurance rates, people driving, the economy, all those types of things. Yes, you can go back and look at how much they're correlated. But I think, as mentioned before, I can't remember at a time where anything else, a shutdown of this magnitude has happened. I know I'm only, 38 years old, but still, don't hold that against me. But this is a little bit different scenario. This isn't consumer behavior driving a recession or, something else like that. This is sort of a shutdown. It's not sort of, it is a shutdown of different industries to a relatively large scale. And so I think this might not be a good situation. It might be. It'll be important to go back and look, though, and see what kind of things emerge from this.
See, and I think, to pivot on that question, your data on freight movement is so much more indicative of the economic impact than personal VMT, I believe. And if we're looking at freight travel coming down, and the two regions, again, that I pointed out, the upper Midwest, which is more manufacturing, and the Gulf area, which is more oil, those are obviously being impacted by multiple factors. But if we're not moving goods, that is an economic hit. And usually when I look at what's going on in the market and I see that diesel demand is strong and truck travel is strong, I feel pretty confident that the economy is doing well. But right now we've got warehouses loaded to the gills. Yep. We have no ability to distribute that product because there's no outlets to distribute it to. So the trucks are starting to not move as much. That to me is much more worrisome than people staying at home cooking dinner.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think it's important to, all of these are some of these are better thought of as a proxy, right? So as I mentioned before, inventories are something that, investors are following, economists are following, and so that's also, that's a big indicator. Whereas the amount people travel, I think, is not as, it's still big, but not as big as something like that, right? So it all kind of works together. And so what we're trying to do is identify, okay, what's going on in this region, what's going on in this state, what's going on, just to try to see, okay, how is this affecting these different industries? We have Boeing in our backyard. So that's something that we're obviously, always looking at, is what's going on with manufacturing, air travel. How does that affect manufacturing? How does that affect goods being shipped to Boeing or other suppliers supplying Boeing with stuff? The chain continues to just grow. And so I think it's better thought of, at least for right now, as sort of a proxy. But I agree with you that, if trucks are moving and goods are getting out, that's more indicative of the economy than personal or passenger VMT. But, both are obviously important.
Well, Bob, thanks for taking the hour to spend with us and chat about this. I am hopeful that the trend is more on the cockroach side than the Punxsutawney Phil side, for the sake of our family-owned businesses. Obviously, we want the cockroaches to be safe and go out there and scurry across the economy with full wallets and mindfulness of giving people their space. But we need to get back to business, and hopefully we can do so safely, quickly. For people on the webinar who want to pay attention to what INRIX is doing, I go to INRIX.com. You want to go to the news site and the blog. The new blog is out, analyzing last week's travel data. Take a look at it. Any other resources they should pay attention to from INRIX, Bob?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent resource. We're going to be, I've kind of hinted at some of that freight data. We're going to be issuing a study with a little bit more in-depth stuff on freight. So I would encourage, when that comes out here shortly, encourage to take a look at that as well. And if you have questions, you can always shoot me an email.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate what you guys are doing and rely on it heavily, so keep up the good work. And for those of you who are interested in what the Fuels Institute is doing, as you can guess, Fuels 2020, a live event scheduled for next month in Dallas, has been transitioned to a virtual event. Go online. We're offering an enterprise-wide registration, so one registration fee. Everybody from your company can participate. We have 5 really good sessions, a couple related to the current situation, but most of them looking long-term at the transportation market in general. fuelsinstitute.org for the latest on that. And Bob, again, thank you very much. Enjoy, looks like sunny
I'll battle area. The sun.
I don't understand sun in Seattle. That doesn't make any sense. It's not sunny here in the DC.
I know. Yeah, it's torture. It's torture.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll be back to you soon with another webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.